Last weekend, I paid a visit to Mailrail and the Postal Museum. Now, I've talked about the history of Mailrail before. If I remember, I'll put a link to that video in the comments section. But what I haven't really talked about is what it's like today as a visitor. So, bit of background, long story short. Mailrail was originally the Post Office Underground Railway. It was a driverless, narrow-gauge underground line that ran between Whitechapel and Paddington in central London, centred on the main sorting office at Mount Pleasant. It opened in 1927 and was closed in 2003. In 2017, the track around Mount Pleasant was reopened as central London's only heritage railway, attached to a museum about Royal Mail. Now, I'd been before, but a couple of my friends hadn't, so we decided to pay it a visit. The museum is located on Phoenix Place, just off Mount Pleasant. Ironically, there are no rail connections at hand, although there are several buses that pass nearby. It's in two buildings. One houses Mailrail itself, the other houses the main museum, as well as the cafe and archive. We started with Mailrail, as the website advises. We were advised to book in advance because it's a very popular attraction. It wasn't too busy when we arrived, which I think was the end of the lunchtime lull, but almost as soon as we got in the queue for the train, a long line built up behind us. That may be just because we're such awesome trendsetters, but I don't think so. The trains were specially built for the reopened line because the original system was not designed to carry passengers. An unfortunate consequence of the line not being built for passengers is that it's also quite cramped. There really isn't anything that can be done about that. If you're tall, be prepared to hunch over. The ride itself is of course the highlight of the experience. The system was mothballed when it closed in the hope that it might reopen in some form, and as a consequence the line is very much as it was when it closed. It even has abandoned trains that you occasionally pass. It feels very much as it must have done when it was in service. There are some audio-visual presentations on the history of the line as you go, and some demonstrations of the various foibles of the system, memorably a power cut, which were common on the old system. There's a lot of information, but it never feels like you're being overloaded or talked at. It's a good balance of education and entertainment that gives you some idea of how intensively this line was worked back in its heyday, and the role it played in the postal system. Plus, of course, you have the fun of riding through a lot of spooky abandoned tunnels. The ride takes about 15 minutes. The nature of the ride means that unfortunately it's not fully accessible, but the museum does offer the audio-visual presentation separately, as well as a reduced accessibility ticket. I'd recommend checking the museum's website for full details. After the train ride, the old railway works houses a display about the railway, including stuff to play with and lots of rolling stock. From a train nerd perspective, it's an excellent collection with representatives of all three generations of rolling stock. I do wonder where the earlier rolling stock came from. Was it in storage here, or was it preserved elsewhere? Next, we stopped in at the cafe. I have no footage of this, so here is the plaster model they photographed to make stamps. The menu was pretty varied and the service was good. The food wasn't exactly cheap, but I think this is inevitable of any museum cafe. Put it this way, by those standards, it was not overpriced. And I thought the quality and variety were very good. Then on to the museum itself. This covers the postal service from its earliest days to the present. Here's a mail coach, including the uniform and equipment of a mail guard. Yeah, when they say use the postcode, they ain't asking. Postman Pat's packing heat. Again, it's a very good display. The history of the post office is a long and complicated story. You have the obvious things like stamps and pillar boxes, but there's also odd little side quests like the history of the telephone service, which was also the responsibility of the post office, and the GPO film unit, responsible for, among other things, night mail. There are places where the post office was far more than just a communication service. This post bus illustrates that. I thought that, again, the display struck a good balance between being informative without being overwhelming. It was aimed at a broad audience. There are information panels, but there are also plenty of hands-on activities for kids. Oh, I don't know a huge amount about the Postal Service, but I did think it was a fairly complete story. I will say that it did seem like there wasn't much on the role of the post office in the modern world. I feel like that's something that's changed dramatically in the 21st century with the rise of instant messaging and email, but also the rise of online shopping. That aside though, I felt like I learned a lot about the history of the service. I'm going to get a little bit theoretical on you here, but I think that whoever was behind these displays was very good at distilling the information into a memorable story. And we got some interesting artifacts to illustrate that. Here's the first Christmas card, for instance. The range of visitors we saw was quite broad, plenty of adults, but also plenty of families. Obviously the train ride would be the highlight for any child, but the whole complex is family friendly. There is a separate play area for kids. There are changing facilities, including emergency changing supplies. This is very handy because, as we all know, there is no greater destructive force in the universe than a baby's lower intestine. The cafe has high chairs and they do offer the use of their first aid room if feeding mothers want a bit of privacy. The museum is fully wheelchair accessible in both sections apart from the actual train ride. Full details of accessibility are given on the website. We found the staff very helpful. We had actually ended up postponing this visit, but we had no trouble moving our booking. The staff on site were approachable and friendly. The museum also has a very good online presence. If you can't get to the actual museum, I do recommend following their Instagram account for snippets from their collection. The website provides all the information you need for a visit, but also some additional stuff. For example, there are walking trails that tell you what you can see on your way from the nearest stations to the museum. Tickets are £17.50 for adults, £12.20 for young people, and £10 for children, plus a range of other tickets listed on the website. There is a small discount if you book in advance. Space is limited on Mail Rail, so I do recommend that you do this. The only major problem with the attraction is that it's not the easiest place to find, and the nearest stations are about half a mile away. Not too bad if you don't mind walking, but worth bearing in mind if you do. Now, none of this is really a complaint, because again, the museum is kind of hamstrung by the fact that it's located on a historic site. You can't exactly move half a mile of 90-year-old underground railway. There are also no parking facilities at the museum, although, in general, if you're visiting central London, what are you even doing in a car in the first place? It's a bad idea. I must emphasise that I have no connection with the Postal Museum or Mail Rail other than as a visitor. I say this because, given the glowing review I've given it, it's going to make me look like I'm shilling it. I am not. I genuinely just think it's a really good visitor attraction. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. If you've visited the museum yourself, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would like to thank, as ever, my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the 60-second interval between my driverless post trains. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.